I'm talking to Nick Juravich. Nick is a graduate student in the history department at Columbia, where he studies, among other things, women, and particularly working women. He's going to help us throughout this MOOC try to understand some of the questions that you might be thinking of or asking yourselves. Nick, what kinds of questions do you have for us this morning?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. And I wanted to start off with a question about why women's history matters. And I should say before I ask it that I've come to realize just how central women's history is to understanding the history of the United States, in part through your guidance, through hearing lectures you've given at talks and conferences where issues you've raised have become central to debates about the whole structure of the American past. And so I've got some ideas about this, but I wanted to hear it from you. Why does women's history matter?
That's, of course, what we call the $64,000 question. Why does women's history matter? Probably the most significant reason for doing women's history is that it helps us to understand the working of power relationships. So if gender, as we've just described it, is a power relationship, a relationship that helps us to structure the world around us, then understanding gender helps us to understand not just how the relationships between and among men and women work, but also relationships of race and class. So women are about half the population, and we have to ask the question of how half the population, for an extraordinarily long period of time, is kept in its proper place, if you like. That is, why women don't rebel. You know, how is it that the relationships of gender manage to keep women stuck exactly where they are in subordinate positions? And how historically has that happened? And we could ask the same questions of race relationships or of relationships between workers and their bosses or their employers. But if we ask it of women, we're really asking it of a huge segment of the population. And then when we begin to explore the answers to those questions, we are taken aback. We're taken aback because, of course, probably the most popular or the most effective way of exercising power is coercion, through the metaphorical or actual whip, through the exercise of prisons and disciplines and punishment and so on, which reveal who's the boss and what happens to you if you don't obey whatever the boss's injunctions are. But among women, it isn't so much coercion. There is some coercion, of course, and we see some of it in things like domestic abuse and so on. It's not so much a coercion as it is ideology that keeps women in their place. That is, it's a belief system that changes over time, to be sure, but that both men and women share. So can't blame men for the subordinate position of women. Women participate in shaping that subordinate position because, like men, women, everybody, or almost everybody, believes that women's roles are natural, just as men's roles are natural. Men's roles are to provide, women's to, you might say, to care, to nurture, and so on. Now, if you really believe that deeply, if you deeply believe that women's roles are nurturing roles, then of course you construct your families, your social systems, your ways of providing around the belief that women will be provided for one way or the other. That's why history matters. We need to interrogate those belief systems. We need to see how they change over time if we're going to understand how power is exercised. And if historians don't understand that use of power, then they will understand very little about how other power relationships get created and how they operate either.
And so as historians of women, as women historians have investigated these ideologies, they've shown us how these belief systems are developed, how they become inculcated. How does this take place historically?
Well, of course, it happens through the education of children, the socialization of children, the socialization of people into the world in which they live. So it comes with a mother's milk. Women, wherever they come from and whatever they do, socialize their children to survive, and to survive in ways that they understand are the best ways possible. And then in modern times, of course, the state picks up. Schools, churches, everybody conspires, you might say, to offer the same message. Lots of women, of course, and lots of men don't conform to the messages that they're taught. But when they don't conform, they normally get punished for nonconformity. So, for example, we think most immediately of the witches of New England. So here are a group of women, and they are mostly women, who are executed for witchcraft. Why are they executed for witchcraft? It turns out that historians who've explored this question note that the women who were executed were almost all of them people who were renegades of one kind or another. They were gossips. They were not properly obedient to their men. They might have been widows. They might have tried to exercise a voice in the community. Nonconformity, which doesn't amount to a crime by our judgment, but which said to the community that they were not quite obeying the injunctions of natural womanhood that they should be adhering to. And therefore, the punishment was due to their failure to appropriately integrate the belief system of the community. Now, that's a pretty horrible example of the way that power gets inculcated and exercised. But just as one has only to watch one slave being whipped, or one woman being burnt at the stake, or dropped in a river with stones around her neck, to recognize that one ought to behave oneself if one doesn't want such a punishment, those kinds of threats provide just an enormous incentive to children, to women, to ordinary people to follow the injunctions of whatever the society is.
Well, and it is a vivid example, and it gets at the question of history in two ways, it seems to me. On the one hand, ideologies naturalize relations of power, and they create histories in which women have always behaved a certain way, and those who behave differently are literally supernatural, are outside the realm of what is natural. And yet, as historians, one of the things that makes it such an exciting discipline for so many of us is not the recitation of a kind of rote heritage, but rather the dynamic of change, investigating this dynamic and understanding that, in fact, these power systems are contingent. They do transform themselves. There are people in every era who challenge them.
Yes, and of course that's one of the most exciting things about studying women's history, is that we find those women everywhere. And when we find them, we then ask the question of what was their experience, what was the contradiction in their lives that led them to see the ideology as ideology instead of as a natural phenomenon. And sometimes that experience, sometimes it comes from a particular kind of education. So, for example, historians have noticed that many so-called rebellious women were educated by their fathers. educated by their fathers in ways that boys were educated, to read and to write and to understand Latin and languages and so on. And that experience exposed them to the possibility that they might be able to challenge a belief system that told them otherwise. That's a simple example. Other women find that their experiences, for example, as enslaved people or as wage workers under the most awful conditions, causes them to challenge the prevailing ideology. One of the intriguing things about women's history is that when we find the rebellion, we ask, what are the contradictions? What were the experiences that led people to understand that the belief system in which they should or ought to have been inculcated wasn't working for them? And that's how history moves forward.